Hello, fellow homebrewers. JP here, and I want to introduce to you the brand new Brew-Built X1 Conical Series available at More Beer. More Beer sells the highest standard in homebrewing equipment, and the Brew-Built Conicals are just that. They're made from mirror-polished 304 stainless steel, and they come with loads of features that you and I have been looking for. They have a full 2-inch bottom dump valve, which will eliminate your clogging issues, while the sturdy base includes 4 reinforced legs, just like those big pro tanks do. More Beer also carries the Brew-Built line of options and add-ons like casters, pressure kits, and even external glycol chillers. So you can find out more about the new Brew-Built X1 Conical Unitanks by going over to morebeer.com for detailed videos on the entire line of Brew-Built Conicals. You can trust Brew-Built with your next fermentation, and you can trust More Beer to find the right conical for you. Brew-Built at morebeer.com.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session. I'm your host, Justin Crosley, and I'm back in the studio today with a guest who is not only not in the studio, but is, a good about halfway across the world from me, and from a country near and dear to my heart, especially in the beer world. And I think you're going to find the same. I've got Brendan Kearney on the show with me today, and he is the author of his new book, Hidden Beers of Belgium. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Where are you right now?
So I am in my home in a small village called Hula, which is on the outskirts of a city in West Flanders called Kortrijk. That's kind of very close to both the Walloon and the French border, and it's an area of Belgium which I guess would be most famous for Oud Bruin, or Flanders Red, as sometimes it's called. Sort of a beer of mixed fermentation that has a sort of a sweet sour profile, and that's kind of the region, I guess, that beer style calls home.
Okay, and I think we can acknowledge right away that that is not a Belgian accent that we're hearing. So not born and raised in this region.
I'm definitely not Belgian. No, I'm originally from Ireland, County Down, South County Down, and I kind of spent most of my life there until I was in my late 20s. I went traveling around the world. And I went to West Africa for a while, went to South America, traveled in Asia. And actually, when I was passing through Peru, I stayed in this kind of earthquake reconstruction volunteer organization for a while. In the city of Pisco, there was a big earthquake, and there was like 120 volunteers from around the world that came to help rebuild homes. And there I met a lady from Belgium. And we stayed in touch for a long period after that, back and forward on cheap Ryanair flights between Belgium and Ireland. And eventually I moved to Belgium in 2013. Started writing about beer a few months later.
Wow.
After discovering, a sort of beer culture that I wasn't really that aware of. I started a blog, Belgian Smack, which became a kind of a website for narrative reported stories, started a podcast, and then I got picked up by a bunch of magazines in the UK and the States to report on the ground about Belgian beer and Belgian beer culture. And
amazing.
Yeah, so 2024, this year, I've just released a book, which kind of is a culmination of all that traveling around Belgium, all those discussions with producers and cafe owners and locals. And yeah, so it's been a long journey, and it's the the book is finally here.
Yeah, I bet that's satisfying. We're going to dive into the book and so many other things with Brendan. Hey, first up, thanks to our sponsor, More Beer, bringing you this show and every show that we do. You can go to morebeer.com. If you're a brewer, home brewer, check out their Brew Built line of jacketed conicals. They're so cool, and they make fermentation as professional as it can be in your home brewery. Or just go to their website, morebeer.com, and check out their deal of the day, because they've always got something cool going on over there. And I'm so thankful for them. After nearly 20 years, More Beer is still my fantastic sponsor, and good friends, good people. So thanks to them for bringing this show to you. If you want to support the Brewing Network in other ways, of course, you can still listen to our other shows, Brew Strong, Dr. Homebrew. We're getting new episodes of those all the time. You can also do your Amazon shopping. You can go support Blickman Engineering, Beersmith, the 21st Amendment, Grog Tag. So many wonderful people that have been with us over the years, and I can't thank them enough. All right. So you did say that when you moved to Belgium, it kind of sparked this interest in beer that you didn't have. But I'm a little surprised to hear that from an Irishman. I want to know about your beer interest before you got to Belgium. Was there any?
Yeah, but it's like my wife always says, in Ireland there is a drinking culture, and in Belgium there's a beer culture. Of course, I drank beer. I went to university in Dublin. My father drank Guinness, and I enjoyed drinking Guinness with him. Beer is obviously a big part of Irish culture, and Irish pubs are famous around the world. So yes, I absolutely enjoyed beer, but when I came to Belgium first, this was like something completely different. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been, and maybe are certainly aware of it, but you're in a small brown cafe. You're presented with a menu. Every beer comes in its own glass. There's a theater of presentation. The beer is, half a glass of foam, incredible foam stability. The flavors are sort of very fermentation forward in comparison to what I had before. The mouthfeel in terms of the carbonation. Yeah, it was just like a totally different experience. And then, of course, you have like such diversity of beer styles, whether it's like a big banana triple or a kind of a vinaigrette red brown beer,
Sure.
or you have the dry kind of fruity sort of white peppery notes of a saison. So like it was just like a whole learning experience, and I was like, do other people know about this?
Yeah.
Which is why I started writing about it. And then, of course, you discover everything in the world of beer. You come across everything that Jackson has written, and then it's only really when you start visiting breweries that you start to like discover more.
Did you enjoy it immediately, or was there kind of a learning curve? When I had my first, real craft beer, my listeners know this, it was a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And I kind of describe it as offensive. My palate was offended by the amount of bitterness and just the change from the really industrial light lager I had been drinking to that point. And again, it happened to me when I had my first sour. Although that offensiveness only lasted for about 5 seconds before I immediately enjoyed it. But I'm curious about coming from a clean beer world, in Ireland, to your first experience. Was it love at first taste or not?
Well, I think I think a lot of people in other countries, their first kind of experiences with hop forward beers. So like, the IPA is like the king of beers in the States. I think when you first come to Belgium, the thing that's most seductive is the Trappist culture. So, and they are readily available, and beers of such high quality that you kind of spend a little time going down the rabbit hole with those beers. And I have since been lucky enough to visit some of those breweries and visit some of those abbeys. And I guess that I did fall in love with that immediately because of the full flavor, because of the alcohol content, because of the culture of the serving in the cafes and everything. But then, I went on my own journey to discover all the other styles. And I would say, like your point about, it takes a minute. I think when I encountered acid, it wasn't an immediate sort of love relationship. I think the first lambic I had was a Eau de Hughes Bone, which would be considered like one of the softer, more malsa, citrus forward, less sort of volatile acidity
Sure.
in that sort of sphere. But I was like, what is this? Like, but of course now lambic is the thing that most turns me on, the thing that is completely shrouded in egos and personalities and politics and the most interesting production processes. So like that's the thing that I actually spend most time writing about and interviewing. So yeah, no, it wasn't immediate, but I think the thing that attracted me was that beer in Belgium like touches so much of life
Yeah.
that it became a way for me. You know, I was probably a little bit lost when I arrived in terms of like exploring this new place that I lived, and beer allowed me to travel. It allowed me to speak to different people in different languages and cross different borders and get into communities and talk about religion and agriculture and engineering and
Sure.
be in cafes and sport. And I think it just allowed me to work out, you know, where I live. And you know, I'm still working it out, and I still haven't got the answer. But
Well, so are the Belgians. I mean, that's why it's been a tradition for as long as it has, right? So, yeah. You know, I think the first, I mean, at that time I just called it a sour beer because that's what I knew. First one I ever had was a Rosé de Gambrinus, a Cantillon beer. And I've described this on the show so many times that, you know, I took a sip and I'm certain I made a face as if it was the worst thing I ever tasted in my life. And I remember making a sound. I remember just going like, oh, that's wonderful. I remember it being like, it hurt at first. And then I couldn't imagine that a beer, you know, would be like that. And I also very quickly learned how, through I think my first interviews, how political the lambic world is. You know, it was described to me as akin to the French and their wine, and it you know, you can't call things certain things unless they come from certain places. And you touch on some of that in your book, so it was a really nice reminder for me to kind of go back to like this really living and breathing world of Belgian beer, and it's one of the things I'm enjoying the most about the book. Let me ask you this before going too much further into the book. Were you a journalist before you became a beer journalist?
No, so I was a lawyer.
Okay.
In Ireland, and yeah. So when I came, I think, you know, there's always been. I've always been fairly creative, so I did some creative writing. I did, you know, do some student newspaper journalism. My family all work in creative industries, so like I have two brothers who are musicians, professional musicians, and another brother who's a playwright and theatre director. And you know, I obviously now I'm doing a lot of writing work. So, but I wasn't a journalist when I arrived in Belgium, and it was the beer that kind of propelled me into storytelling, I suppose.
Okay. And the first thing you did was start the blog, you said, which is Belgian Smack. Yeah.
I just started the blog, didn't really know what I was doing.
Okay.
Worked it out. And through working with different magazines and different editors, I learned how to structure stories, how to report, how to interview people.
How did you get your foot in the door, even with the editors and the magazines at that time? Were you reaching out? Were they stumbling across your blog?
There was a pretty well-known magazine for about 10 years in Belgium called Belgian Beer and Food. It was a 64-page glossy magazine that, you know, I guess treated Belgian beer culture like wine, like a wine magazine might.
Okay.
So it had beautiful photography. It was kind of a mixture of like smaller independent producers and the sort of bigger regional family breweries. And the editor of that it was a guy called Paul Walsh, who was another Irish guy living in Brussels. And he came across Belgian Smack and reached out to me because he was looking for native English speaking writers who had some knowledge of beer. And then I just started working on that for a bunch of years.
Okay. Yeah, kind of like a lot of the writers I know. It's none of us went to school for beer journalism. I mean, now maybe they do. God, I shouldn't say it anymore. Maybe the young people do go to school for beer journalism. But back when we started, right, you just kind of got your foot in the door and figured it out.
Yeah, well, I think there was like I was on a kind of a journey of like learning about like beer. So I did, obviously I did the Cicerone program and I did the BJCP sort of exams, and then I did there's a beer sommelier course in the Institute of Brewing and Distilling in London. So I got the train over to do that one.
Nice.
And I did a couple of courses in Belgium. I did one called the Algemene Bierkenner, which is like a general beer knowledge or sommelier course, and then I did a brewing course in Belgium. So that was kind of that all helped me to talk, shop with brewers in a way that they would just not dismiss me. And then on the other side, I was like, I became obsessed with like American magazine journalism. So, I became a subscriber of the New Yorker. I used to read the Atlantic, GQ. How do you set someone up on a quest? How do you write a really strong lead? How do you have character arcs going through a story? And that kind of continued as I worked with really good editors at, Good Beer Hunting. The Brussels Times is a national paper that I'm the beer columnist for. And I kind of built up a staple of people that supported me and that helped me get better.
Excellent.
So yeah, that was kind of all going on at the same time.
Sure. Okay, important question. Maybe the most important question of this entire interview. Do you put a glass of beer on your desk when you write? Either the articles or this book or whatever. Is consuming a beer part of your process?
I personally don't.
Okay.
Because there's quite a few tabs open. I'm going to have a couple of interview transcriptions open on there. I'm going to have some notes on my arc or my narrative plot. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have a tab open with a bunch of other resources that I might be quoting or pulling from or referring to. And I kind of want to stay clear-headed. Mm-hmm. It might be that what I do is like, I also like to like write kind of with the door closed and then edit with the door open. So I will then maybe print it off so I can see it on a different format, put it in a different font. At that point, maybe I'll crack a beer, sit down in a different room, and then red pen it so that it's almost like I'm reading with different eyes.
Yeah.
But generally, I want to approach it in a professional way because I think if I don't treat it seriously, then how can the reader take it seriously?
For sure. Well, and of course, I meant too that sometimes, especially in beer writing, the beer is the muse, right? In your case, and I think we're going to talk about this when we dive into some of my favorite parts about the book, the people making the beer are the muse, right? But so some people I've talked to like, yeah, no, I can't really write about this beer unless I'm having it, unless I'm also enjoying it, So not to get shit-faced while you're writing, but just to...
Yeah, no, but I think, I guess that you obviously you're tasting the beers and you have to be able to talk about the flavor profile of the beer and how that beer was produced. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I've done so much reporting and sharing that beer with its producers or with other people that I'm talking to that by the time I'm coming to write, I kind of know the beer pretty well.
Yeah.
And like you say, sometimes the beer is the character, but most of the time it's like the character, the main protagonist of the story is, maybe not even its producer, but like there's a story in the book about Triumph, which is a smoked ale from Brasserie Dupont, which is a fairly famous brewery in Wallonia. Everyone knows it from Wanette, from Saison. But this Triumph beer is a beer which has their fingerprints all over it, but which is not that well known. And I one of the main characters in that story is a guy who runs a bar in Ghent, who were having an anniversary. It's a famous cafe in Ghent, and they were having a 100th anniversary of the cafe and the building, and they were tasked in a very short period of time to produce a new beer, and he was looking for an organic beer, and there were very few producers at that time of organic beer. So he stumbled upon this Walloon brewery that he had worked with before called Dupont, and like that guy, his sort of that escapade in securing Dupont to make that beer, in delivering something which was appropriate for such a historically significant institution of a cafe, the Salon of Ghent, it's known, without, with an amazing history. That guy sort of becomes the protagonist of the story, Willy Verheuyen, and he's not really a known, sort of superstar brewer or anything. But when he told me, I said, is this beer significant in terms of how much you sell.
Mm.
And he said, because I thought this was like going to be a niche smoke deal that maybe a couple of people would order and they'd sell a few bottles or maybe have a few crates. And he turned around and he said, "Oh, after our lager, our mass pills, this Alken mass beer, it's our second biggest selling beer and has been for the
Wow.
last 10 years."
Wow.
And I was just like, what? And I was like, nobody knows about this beer, even though people know about Dupont. So like in the book, there are, a bunch of breweries that people probably haven't really heard of, but there are also beers that people haven't heard of from, more well-known breweries or more well-known sort of producers. And I think I wanted to have that mix. I wanted to have a mix of, startup brew pubs. I wanted generational family breweries, bigger regional breweries, like tiny experimental, friends who were, in a sort of a garage type environment. And, it didn't want to like be a very one-dimensional in the type of producer because that's just not what the beauty and the joy of Belgian beer culture is.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so like I was kind of starting to say, I do think that one of my favorite parts about the book is your take on that and the way you go about it. After 20 years of doing this, the beer is still very interesting, but the people are so far more interesting and their stories so that's one where you start with the person and you end up with this crazy success story of a beer that should not be the most popular beer at Saison Dupont. It just shouldn't, and it is, and that's just so these things still fascinate me about the beer world, and I just do in the book like your approach, and so. Normally I would ask you like what inspired the book, but I think you've already kind of told us that, just that your love of Belgian beer and the years spent covering it have sort of now culminated in this work. And you describe in the book, in the beginning, I believe in your introduction, that access to these beers and the people can be, I guess, at best intimidating, and at worst, like downright difficult. And you do start to provide access through the book. I do want to ask you, do you find that these beers that you're representing in the book, by the way, there's 24 beers that Brendan focuses on. Brendan and his photographer, Ashley Joanna, who does a really fabulous job documenting the journey that they've taken with these 24 beers to highlight. Do you find the beer culture there to be accessible to lay people? Or do we really have to be like you and I and really like an intense beer nerd to have access to the Belgian beer world that you're describing?
Well, I think the kind of concept of beer tourism is something that is probably growing a little bit in Belgium in terms of like breweries being aware of it and targeting it and trying to make some sort of a visitor experience, whether it's, throwing a couple of chairs together in a small side part of their production facility or building a sort of a grand tour in a location which has got some, city significance or something. But generally, I think access is difficult. Just because I think that's not top of mind for a lot of brewers in Belgium. They're working with their distributors. They have the cafes that they're getting their beer into, and that's the place that they're expecting for their beers to be enjoyed. Perhaps that's slightly different, to maybe American culture where you have this rise of tap rooms, because producers want to take more margin, at the source.
Sure.
And, it's a business model, which, in some cases is a real necessity. But in Belgium, I think, tap rooms are appearing, but they're definitely still in the minority, and it's still a cafe culture. Now, there's other things that are happening in Belgium that are maybe changing a little bit, but getting Belgian brewers to answer emails is really difficult. Getting them to talk openly about their ingredients and their recipe, it can be difficult. That's not to say that everyone it was like that. There are a bunch of people in the book who were extremely generous and open about how they're producing the beers. But I guess like while there is a big focus on the narrative part of all the stories of the people and the places that these beers have come from, I also wanted to make it like very useful for beer enthusiasts and home brewers and commercial brewers, in that there's a bunch of technical information about the beer, not just like all the kind of IBU and the EBC and the specs and everything, but like the list of ingredients to as accurate a level as I could, pull out of people.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
We, so like I think it's also like I'm really proud that I've kind of managed to do that, because in some cases, I had to ask a bunch of times, and maybe I had to go there a bunch of times to sort of gain some level of trust.
Sure. All right. Well, this is the perfect time for us to take a quick break so that we can really dive into the content of the book, because I think you've really set it up with kind of what people can expect. There are stories, there are ingredients, there are timelines, there are locations that you have and have not heard of, and it's a fascinating read. It's kind of, to me, by the way, it's kind of the book that doesn't just sit on my coffee table. It's the book that's on the airplane with me on my way to Belgium. So that, because like even as I was reading it, I'm like, oh man, when's my next trip? And I think that was part of your point. So when we come back, we'll dive into that content and more with Brendan Kearney, author of the new book, Hidden Beers of Belgium. And you can go to Belgian Smack, that's SMAAK.com, and check out the podcast, the blog, how to get the book, and more. We'll be right back here on The Session. Welcome back to The Session. We are hanging out with Brendan Kearney, the author of Hidden Beers of Belgium, brand new hardcover, and we're talking about everything you need to know about this book and why it should be on your shelf as well. Before we dive more into it, hey, thanks to our wonderful sponsor, the 21st Amendment Brewery. Congratulations, Sully and the 21st Amendment crew. They just won a silver medal at the Great American Beer Festival for probably my favorite 21st Amendment beer, which is El Sully. You can get El Sully now. You can also get El Sully Lime on the shelf here in the U.S. And for you Belgians, hey, every now and then you can find El Sully roaming the streets of Belgium himself. It's a place I know he loves to go. So thanks to the 21st Amendment. Go to 21st-amendment.com and check out everything you need to find their beer. And congratulations once again. All right. So we're talking about the stories in the book, and I thought I might just bring up a couple. So one of the cool things I think about your philosophy of the book was not just to highlight, and maybe specifically not to highlight, the super well-known everybody, like, let's just say it, like everybody knows Cantillon. And I feel it seems like you felt that didn't fit the theme of the hidden beers of Belgium. So maybe you could describe to us what your criteria was that makes a hidden beer of Belgium.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as you said, I mean, there are a bunch of breweries that I think could easily be in this book, and I could have found really interesting and inspiring storylines. Those are breweries that I respect, so it did hurt a little bit to leave them out, but I had to try to be honest with myself about what was appropriate and what I was trying to do. So, for example, I didn't include Cantillon, even though they're in the book in the back section, in which I list sort of 60 other interesting beers. The same with Drie Fonteinen, one that I really struggle with because they've been so important to sort of modern Belgian brewing culture, is Brasserie de la Seine.
Love that brewery.
They had a beer on the long list for a long time, but I had to be honest with myself and like follow my heart a little bit. So I had a kind of in the book, there's a list of things which, the criteria. So, has to be within Belgium, has to have its own facility, has to be an independent brewery, has to be a beer of a certain level of quality. It has to be, there's a bunch of 10 rules. But I think in terms of the curation, there was probably a more nuanced consideration on my part. So I wanted to represent the whole of Belgium. So geography was important. I couldn't just do, everything from West Flanders, everything from Vlaams-Brabant, everything from, and there are some regions of Belgium which have a much greater density of extremely good producers than others. Another was style diversity. So it wasn't the hidden triples of Belgium or the hidden IPAs of Belgium. It was the hidden beers of Belgium. So, I had to balance out all the things that, Belgium can offer, and kind of justify that a little bit. And I also like obviously wanted to include certain producers who I felt people should know about and who had incredible stories.
Yeah.
And then of course the beers had to be all stand up on their own as well.
Sure.
So there's like that was kind of all going on in the back of my head. But absolutely there were producers that, you know, I would have liked to have included, but I just had to be honest with myself and say, you know, we'll put them in an extra section at the back and we'll offer some good suggestions. But for the deep profiles and the kind of narrative runs and the kind of the comprehensive sort of photography that we took, we will be selective and we'll take 24 and we'll go deep on those
and really dive in. And you did. And it also kind of runs the spectrum. And this surprised me a little bit, but it runs the spectrum a bit on the age of the breweries. Some of my favorites in there, I've got one, a notable one that's been in existence since 1818. Then I jumped to one. A really cool story that I want to talk to you about there. 1919. I jumped to one from 1919, and then the first one I want to talk about because it's a brewery I knew about, but I didn't know anything about their story, and that's all the way to like 2009 with Tilquin. Now Tilquin is a beer that occasionally I can get here if I go to the right places. And to me, and I think your storyline kind of follows this. They are a new, let's just call them new, even though 2009 for Belgian standards, they're new. They fit the tradition of Belgian beer so well. Like to me, they just came out of the gate with this very traditional style lambic that blew my mind. In fact, until I researched it, I just was like, wow, how did I not know about this 200-year-old brewery? That's how their beer came across to me. And in your story with them, you kind of you tell that story as well, like why they taste as if they've been around for 200 years. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Tilquin and why they were chosen?
Yeah, so there's two, well, actually blenders. I think Tilka actually has a brewery as of maybe the last 9 or 10 months, but there's nothing has been, bottled from the wort that they've produced there. So there's two lambic producers, blenders. One is a kind of a very new one, a young guy who has a farm who studied or worked for a while at Driefonteinen. And then you have Pierre Tilka, who is interesting on a number of levels. He is a Walloon, so he's from the French-speaking part of Belgium. And maybe for those that don't know, aside from like Cantillon in the city of Brussels, who are French-speaking, like the majority of the producers of lambic are Flemish, and traditionally, if you look across the board, Driefonteinen, Boon, and Den Herberg, the Kam, it's all Flemish producers. And actually, Pierre's production facility is just across the border by a couple of kilometers in Wallonia. So there was this kind of initial, I wouldn't say treatment of him, but this like sort of skepticism about a new producer, because when he came in, there hadn't been a new producer in Horal for a long time.
Can you describe what that is just for our listeners? Because this is something I learned from your book.
So that's the Hoge Raad van Artisanal Lambic, which is the High Council of Artisanal Lambic or Craft Lambic, I suppose you want to call them. They're basically a membership body of producers which aims to protect the authenticity or tradition of traditional lambic.
Okay.
Now there's a lot of politics around that because there are certain members who other producers would claim have not done their best in protecting traditional lambic, and therefore you have certain members who do not want to be a part of that, even though it contains the majority of lambic producers. So, for example, the Van Roy family from Cantillon are not a part of Horal and never have been. Driefonteinen left 2 or 3 years ago. There are others who I know from speaking directly to them are considering leaving. And then you have other people leading it like Oud Beersel, Frank Boon, who want to, despite its imperfection, use unity as a way to, push forward the sort of commercial viability and sort of government policy protection of the beer. So that's an interesting organization in itself. But Pierre is like fully on board. He sees the value in being part of it. You know, Tour de Cuse, there's certain like distribution conversations you can have when you're a member.
But he was outside of the regional dimension of it, right? So
yeah, and also just culturally, he was French speaking, and he wasn't even for Brussels. And I'm not saying that, you know, there was a hard line, but I think there was skepticism at that time in terms of, you know, we don't know what this guy's like. We don't know what type of beer he's going to make. He was coming from a background of statistics. So he was doing I think he was doing like agricultural breeding statistics, and he did a PhD. But of course, all that actually comes out in his personality, because he is extremely detail oriented and has a very scientific approach to, maybe in comparison to some of his colleagues, which would have a more artistic approach. But I mean, he's also that has really meant that his lambic is very malsa, which is like soft. So you have in Belgium, you have like a spectrum between malsa and harde Cuse. And I think the intimation is that the harde is like more volatile acidity, and the malsa is like got more like sort of lactic citrus quality to it, much more drinkable, much softer. And so I mean, he's sort of, you know, he is now highly respected in that group in terms for the beers he makes. But one of the things that was interesting about what he did was he realized that he needed to arrive with something a little bit different to kind of make his mark.
Yeah.
In a market where there were a lot of good Eau de Cuse, and also, you know, where he had to where nobody really knew him. So he came out with a plum lambic.
Instead of like the traditional raspberry or cherry.
Yeah, exactly. So the creek would be the you know, the very common one, and then raspberry less so, but it's also traditional. And he came with plum, and it worked really well, and it kind of became this iconic moment where other producers who were interested in spontaneous fermentation or mixed fermentation sort of realized that we don't have to use the traditional fruits, and we can, you know, try new things. And there was a period sort of leading on from his first years in the middle of the last decade, sort of 2013 to 2018, where there was a lot of new stuff happening and a lot of experimentation. And I think his arrival and his plum lambic inspired a lot of that. He's also a very interesting character. I mean, there's a quote in the book that he, you know, he admits himself that he's quite a difficult person to work with. He's got quite a spiky character. He's got his own very defined vision, and he did do some work placements at Cantillon André Fontaine, but I think realized very soon that he wouldn't be able to work for anybody else. So he has that reputation, and he's just like an interesting character to build a story, you know, around.
That was one of my favorite parts of his interview, where he really said, I realized, even the way he describes this thing, like it's very scientific. I realized with my specific character that I couldn't stay in small breweries, says Tilken. If I wanted to work in a lambic blendery or brewery, I'd have to create my own. And you can sense the humor, but I can picture him delivering that dry as a bone. You know?
Deadpan, totally deadpan. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it ends up, just this fascinating story. And, you know, I learned so much that he, as you said, really started as a blendery up until this day, where he was buying wort from other certified lambic breweries, and then fermenting it himself, or aging it rather, and blending it, and was really a blender for so many years. He's only just recently got his own equipment, hoping to do his own 1, 2, and 3 year blends that are 100% from his brewery, which is a cool journey. And, you know, in American craft beer, we can sometimes people are a little hard on contract brewers, as we would call them. But as I've learned over the years, especially with lambic beer and some others, blending is the real art anyway. And so if he went to these other lambic producers and learned the art of blending, clearly it is fine to be a contract brewer. And I think the quality of his beers have proven that. So it's cool for me to read through that story and just kind of expand on my like limited knowledge of a beer I already love, right? So and I think you addressed this also in the beginning of your book where, this book can be for people like me who already know a bit about these breweries and you're going to learn more. Or you can be a complete layman like, hey, I've heard about this Belgian beer and I'm going to Belgium. And I do think it does fit that bill. You describe it well.
Yeah, I think like there's going to be people in Belgium for sure who know all 24 beers pretty well. But I am 100% confident that there's no one who knows the stories of all 24 beers because I've been reporting on them for years and I didn't know a lot of what I discovered in the book. And it's only by going out and talking to people that you can learn this. So even if you do know the beers and are very aware of the producers, there's no way that everyone's going to know everything in the book,
Sure.
Which I hope gives it value for people.
Absolutely. All right. So, and by the way, you did mention that you kind of dive in as much as you can about the ingredients and some of the process. You certainly give the basic information that is important and sometimes not easy to find, like when the brewery was founded. And of course, where you can find them. You list not only the brewery location, but some of the cafes and bottle shops that you can find the beers at, which is super helpful. The times, and I'm a terrible traveler. I love to travel, but I'm really lazy about it. And I just kind of dive in and see where things take me. This book would have done wonders for me on any of my Belgian trips because I could have continued to be lazy and you just give me a couple addresses. Like all I need is to flip to a favorite place and there's addresses to find it. So I like that. Before I mention the next brewery and beer that fascinated me, I did want to ask you about the difficulty in getting some of the beer information from the brewers. Here on the Brewing Network, over the years, it has run the gamut in this studio about what questions brewers are willing to answer. All the way from like, I'm really not going to tell you anything. If you want to talk about the beer and how it tastes and where you can get it, I will do that. Otherwise, your listeners should figure it out themselves. I've had that. All the way to breweries just telling every single detail because not only are they happy to share their beer, but they believe it's the brewer that makes the beer anyway. What did you find interviewing Belgian brewers?
Well, it really varies, of course. I think probably the generalization would be that the younger, kind of more international facing producers, and by that I mean like inspired by the brewing cultures of other countries, are generally much more open and will tell you everything. So, tell me the commercial dry yeast that you use. Tell me how you hydrated your yeast. Tell me like what temperature you're fermented in. Like what's your conditioning regime. Tell me everything about packaging. Hop varieties. Some will just like show me their recipe, and then there are others. And again, mostly generalizing, but more on the traditional side, who are less or more reluctant to kind of share everything with you. I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps because I think with so many brands in Belgium which are fermentation forward and have kind of a mystery or some sort of mysticism about how great they are.
Yeah.
That they're reluctant to kind of pop or burst the bubble with the consumer.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So that the key for me was to be persistent and try to explain why I was asking, because people are really interested in this beer. They're interested in how it's produced, and by sharing some information about like the decisions that you took, people can have a greater appreciation for this beer. So, it was really a case of a little bit of negotiation, a little bit of explaining, and being very persistent. Yeah. So sometimes I wasn't able to get as much of the detail as I wanted, but most of the time I was able to get what I needed.
Sure. Well, at the very least, each beer that you showcased, we are seeing what kind of malt, we are seeing what kind of hops. We're usually seeing what kind of yeast, although sometimes it'll say sort of proprietary blend or something like that. So at the very least, for the beer, the specific beer, and not the whole brewery that you've showcased, you've gotten, I think, plenty enough that us home brewers and pro brewers can be fascinated by it and want to try it more. There's a beer I'll mention after this one that uses American hops, and I found that was cool throughout a couple of them. When I started, I think maybe a year or two after I started was the first time Belgians started to use some American hops, and I remember my first Belgian IPA, which was terrible, by the way, as were most Americans' first IPAs, by the way. But it's sort of grown now, and it's cool to read those stories. Okay, but the brewery I want to mention next, the beer is, I think it's maybe pronounced Bison? Bison?
Bison, yeah.
Bison?
Yeah, from Knude. Knude, yeah, in Eine in Oudenaarde, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so Knude is the brewery, founded in 1919, and this is one of at least a couple stories in the book of a brewery that almost went under. Right? Like a family tradition that...
Yeah, so that's like, 1919, Alphonsus Knude opens a soap factory and then changes it into a brewery. His family have it for a couple of generations, but it comes a point when the owner's three sons are off doing their own jobs. So you have one of them's a lawyer, one of them's a teacher, one of them is an accountant, the Knude brothers. And they basically grew up in the brewery, and the brewery is like, nestled in the village, and they kind of don't want it to die. So they have a decision to take. And the kind of the background to that is that, it's not really a commercial brewery. It's brewing a beer which is certainly not something which has like commercial longevity. It's actually like a creek version of an Oud Bruin. So it's like a fruited Oud Bruin. But the interesting thing about that story is like how deep the beer in the brewery goes into the village.
Yeah.
So the village is Eine, which is like a gemeente or like a suburb of the city of Oudenaarde in East Flanders. And the brewery is situated or located right beside the village cemetery. And the water source of the brewery goes underneath the graveyard. Mm-hmm. And so the locals... instead of calling it Bison, the beer, the name of the beer, they call it Kerkhofsop, which means cemetery juice. Yeah. So this like cemetery juice is the nickname of the beer in the village. And there's, I was, when I went in to do these interviews, I was aware of this mythology, and I was like, this can't be true that,
right.
The water would go through these dead bodies and the nutrients of the bones, and it would then come into like this sort of, water supply, which would then be pulled from, the brewery would pull from.
Yeah.
And I kind of asked the owner of the brewery and I was like, that's not true, is it? And he was like, I mean, I think it is true. There was no embarrassment. There was no denying it. And he was like, yeah, I mean, we're open about it.
Yeah.
We tell people. And I was like, and he's like, so I'm like, the water's actually coming through like without any sort of treatment or anything through that part. And he's like, I mean, he just turned around and he said, well, it's a circular economy. Yeah. so I'm like, okay. And then what I realized was like that the brewery was something which the village and the family were doing out of love and nostalgia. And they brew just a few times a year. And every time they brew, it's a party. And everyone who comes has to help out. They de-pit the cherries there together when they're drinking. On the day they're adding, the cherries, everyone has a part. The cafe right beside the brewery is absolutely jam-packed every time they brew, just a couple of times a year. So it's a real event. And the other interesting thing is that the village itself is extremely important in terms of like the history of war in Belgium. So there's this river, and it was one of the kind of the times that the Americans actually helped stop the Germans crossing the Hindenburg line and effectively, making sure that they didn't win the war. And there's a very interesting story about what happened. And, since then, American families of those soldiers have come back and celebrated with the villagers in the brewery. And the symbol of that American regiment was the bison. which is a symbol of community and of strength. And there are two massive bisons on each side of the bridge where it happened. And there's also bisons all over the village. And there's a bison in the brewery. And of course, the bison is on the cafe beside the brewery, and it's on the label of the beer. And it's just like it's just a story that you're so unlikely to find in any other country, and a beer as well that is quite a difficult one to keep alive. And yet they've managed to do it. So it's very quirky and strange, and
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen anytime again.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the stories in the book that it gave me chills, to read in a good way. It was such a warming story. And of course, my initial reaction, probably like our listeners right now, was, wait a minute, the water through the bones? But you read on and you listen to some of the quotes and the reactions from the owners. You get an impression of how the village feels about it, how the town feels about it. And then you hear this story about an American infantry like helping to save the town in the First World War. And the whole thing culminates in this incredible story of beer that you tell so well. And so this is still the stuff I love about beer. And you're right. This would not happen in any other country, and it's probably never going to happen again. This particular type of tale around beer, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So one more that I wanted to mention, and by the way, I'm curious about, I'm going to end up asking you, what moments stuck with you. How long did it take you to put this book together, by the way? That might help me.
Well, I think like a lot of it is based on work I've been doing for like the last 10 years. So, obviously I've been everywhere in Belgium interviewing different breweries. But in terms of like the book, writing to the book, I think I signed a contract in 2022 with the publisher. Okay. So it's what, 2.5 years? Yeah. 3 years? So
okay.
2.5 years, yeah.
Well, it reads like you've been doing it for a decade, I'll tell you that. And that's a compliment. That's in a good way. So, Brewery Contreras. Now, this one goes back. Like this is what, one of the breweries you think of age-wise when you think of Belgium. Back to 1818. And another one, Brewery Contreras, which clearly has had to pass through generations. And I believe it was passed on to the daughter of the family who didn't care about brewing. Not that she didn't care about beer. I didn't mean to say that. But she didn't care about brewing. But it just so happens that her husband did. And secretly, I guess, had been going to brewing school. And secretly, I mean, the patriarch of the brewery didn't know that his son-in-law had been taking lessons to brew beer, taking classes, in anticipation of hopefully one day his side of the family inheriting the brewery, which is exactly what happened. And I'd love to hear more about it from your take. But I wanted to point out, it's one of the cool beers that after all of this tradition since 1818, the new brewer started using American hops. And not in all the beers, of course. He kept all of the traditional beers going, as he should, as I'm sure he felt that he should. But he also said, hey, why don't we try something new? And I think it turned out to be a big hit and opened the door for other Belgian breweries to do the same. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're picking all the oldies here, the old breweries. No, this is Contreras. It's in Havre. It's a village in East Flanders, and the brewer that you mentioned is a guy called Frederik de Vreese. His wife's family owned the brewery. But I think to understand like the story of this brewery, you need to understand like the history of the brewery itself, because this is like, as you say, I mean, they have beers which reference the kind of the seasonal farm brewing that they would have done with their Mars Special beer. Tonica is a beer that they still produce, which has like a long history. And like a lot of kind of smaller regional family brewers, it also, had a go at Pils, and its Contra Pils is still one of its most important beers. But when Frederik de Vries came in, he, as you say, took over from the father Willy Contreras, and he kind of introduced these new Belgian ales, top fermented beers. But the thing I guess that he took over was this dying brewery. And I tried to explain how bad the situation was. it's like a brewery from another century. You've got the Bodolo cooler, you've got the old copper vessels, you've got the troughs for the filtration. And he wasn't even labeling beers. It was just like capping a certain color for every beer. And if you didn't know what cap was which beer, you didn't know what beer you were buying.
Right.
Bottling was an absolute nightmare. And actually, at one point when he took over the federal FAVV, which is like the Belgian Federal Food Safety Authority, came in and said, like, we're shutting you down. So he had a choice, like, do I walk away from this and do something else? He was a landscape architect, or do I double down and like try to save this thing, even though it's gonna probably be every single day for the next number of years and a massive amount of capital investment. So that's what he did. He decided to go for it. He turned around all the cold side stuff, new fermenter, CCTs, made it really modern for quality purposes, but he kept all the hot side old stuff with all the character. And
he closed for a year to do that also, which is another financial hit, obviously.
And a financial risk, obviously. But I think he kind of saw a little bit of success with his first Belgian ales. And, I call him like the quintessential Belgian brewer, because Belgian brewers are brave, but they're also extremely practical. And, he produces this beer, which is like super drinkable, but characterful, very balanced. And the opportunity came. There's a massive cycling race. I'm sure you're aware cycling is pretty big in Belgium culturally. So it's like one of the main sports. And there's a big race called the Ronde van Vlaanderen, the Tour of Flanders. And it's a grueling race on cobblestone hills across the Flemish Ardennes. It's notoriously difficult. You're bumping up and down as fast as you can on these cobblestones with massive crowds at the side. It's piss and rain. You're going through all these tiny villages, but it's like very iconic and a massive cultural event as well. But every year there's a village of the Ronde, a village of the Tour that's kind of chosen. And in that year that he was releasing these new beers, they picked Havre, and Havre town came to the brewery and said, "Hey, we're village of the Tour. We need a beer."
Yeah.
So then he produced this beer and he said, I needed to be something different. And no breweries really were using American hops. So he just took his Belgian blonde ale, Valère, and he basically dry hopped it with Amarillo and used, I think, a touch of Amarillo in the back end. And, basically maintained all the character of the Belgian ale, but gave this kind of all those grapefruit and tropical fruit notes that Amarillo gives you. And it became this kind of, I guess, watershed moment when Belgians were like, oh, let's maybe look into that. Now, of course, they're quite conservative, so they haven't, gone as maybe excessively into those seductive Yakima hops as other countries have. But it could be, people forget that, that wasn't really around in Belgium, in the late 2000s. And that was quite an interesting story. And like shooting that story, because we worked with Ashley, who's this photographer. She's actually from New Jersey, New York area. She lived in Belgium for a couple of years. And we wanted to shoot every story rather than just turn up at the brewery and, shoot people drinking beers.
Yeah.
So the Valère name of the beer and the Valère name of the range of beers is also a very famous name in the village. So there's like a brotherhood of the Valère, the Confrérie de la Valère, and there's like a Valère biscuit that's very famous and everything. But there's a statue in the town called Valère, which is named both for soldiers in a war, but also for like an inhabitant of the village in the 1950s. And we wanted to go and shoot the brotherhood in their gowns, holding the beer, at the statue, right? Just to kind of sort of visualize this element of the story and how important it was to the village. And Ashley drove for 3 hours to get to Havre, and when she showed up, the whole place around the statue was a construction site, and she couldn't get access to it. And all these people are there standing with their gowns ready to get the photograph taken, and they've got the beers and the specific glassware for the shot. And she calls me in a bit of a panic, because like she's driven so far, and it's such an important visual element of the story for the book.
Yeah.
So there's like a big negotiation with the construction workers. We're trying to explain in English what the hell we're doing. We're writing a book about Belgian beer.
Yeah.
So they eventually move their high-vis vests out of the way. We get right up close to the Ashley and the subjects get right up close to the statue. She shoots up so you can't see any of the muck or
I can see that. Yeah.
All the bricks and construct. So it's like it shoots up with the Valère statue in the background, this kind of like big granite statue. and they're all smiling in their gowns with their beer, and it's like a kind of a very strange, quirky image. And I think it turned out really well. But like, there's so many things that happened during the production of the book that it's just like you just have to try and get it done, you know. And
Yeah,
things were important to do that maybe other books wouldn't have done.
sure. Man, I don't mean to pile a bunch of work on you, but I feel like, and I know you have a podcast, I feel like I think you have 24 20-minute episodes that could, because I'm learning, you know, I saw this picture as I'm reading through, and it's a little odd. It's a little different than the rest of the photos in the book. And so now to know exactly why and the background is awesome. It's fascinating. So anyway, that's an idea for you. 24 20-minute episodes behind the scenes.
I have all the audio from all the interviews because
nice.
like one of my rules is like if I'm quoting somebody, I have it on tape because, you know, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't misrepresenting anything anybody said, and that it not only was the actual words correct, but the tone and the meaning behind it. So I wanted to like have that backup for myself and for the editors who were holding me to account in terms of, you know, both the story consultancy and narrative part, but also like the cultural fact checking and everything. So, you know, that's something that potentially I could do. And there is like, you know, obviously you could go deep on some of the things that are in the book, but also a lot more around the things around the brewery, because you have a word limit for each entry, of course.
Sure. Well, that's something the complete audio companion, man. It's, you know. So the type of reading I do, I love that you have this word limit. And it was something I was going to mention. So we're talking about these in-depth stories. And if anybody's intimidated about that, don't worry. The book is so accessible. And I don't mean that it's so short that you're not getting the story, because clearly from what you're hearing from us, you are. But it's also not so long that you can't just take it with you and get through 24 beers. And that's what I really like about it. You've gone in depth without going too much in length. And that's the style of beer reading I want to do. If that makes sense. I'm not going to read a novel about, you know, I don't read the Oxford Compendium of Beer, which is a real book, folks. This is more my style. Get me deep into the story, and then let me go off and do the rest, right? But I would listen to the audio companion. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a real challenge for me. I'm so glad, like in the format that we have now as well, because like you know, shooting the stories, we have this kind of cinematic, dramatic photography that I think is quite different for a beer book. Mm-hmm. But I mean, my staple is actually like 4,000 word narratives on like, you know, cultural issues around Belgian beer. You know, I'm doing those and working on those a lot for the last sort of 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
So for me, this was like a slightly different format where I had to be more disciplined and have like a very serious conversation with myself about what are the elements here that have to go in. And, you know, it's not just like cutting paragraphs, because you have to contextualize things and you have to decide which themes are most important. So, yeah, it was a real challenge for me, and I think probably a good exercise for me to work some muscles that maybe I hadn't worked before.
Well, at the risk of making you rack your brain, you know, I guess normally I would ask like what moments you had that stick out to you. But now that you've said that, I want to know if there were like some particular moment that you had to cut out that was like, but you loved it. You just were like, how can I not put this in? But you had to kind of cull something down.
I mean, there was anguish with every story, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Like there were moments like there's a brewery in the book called Brasserie. It's actually Misery, which is like a English word. It's I mean, they say on some media, I think, where they don't want to get too deep, that it's named after a Stephen King novel. But when they talked to me, they were talking a bit more honestly about the economic misery in the Liège Valley where the brewery is based. So it's this old manor house, which is very beautiful in an area where there's a lot of like therapeutic water history. So the manor used to be like this water science lab, and a kind of a place where people would bring their horses and stay overnight. And but it's also, when they found it was kind of also like this haunted house, and that's why the references to Stephen King.
Yeah.
It's the Manoir de Harzé, and they kind of actually traveled a little bit in Canada to study brewing, and they spend a little bit of time in Vermont and were really inspired by the Alchemists. So they're one of the few breweries in the book who are producing like sort of hazy ales, hoppy ales,
Okay.
and doing it well, because it's not something that Belgium sort of is well known for or does well. But I think with that inspiration, and especially someone whose family, has a kind of an brewing engineering background, because the brewer, Remy Perret, his father and grandfather worked at Jupiler, which is now famous for the Jupiler beer, the lager. It's in the Liège province, and that was like pre Ebi InBev, back when, and like Ebi InBev obviously buying it hurt them economically because they laid off a lot of staff and they moved production to Leuven for a lot of beers up at Stella. But I think when I was talking to those guys, we were talking about that inspiration from New England, and we were talking about the absolute beauty of the area in which the manor is located, and the fact that they have this small tap room. They live in the manor with their family, with two young kids. But one of the things that we were talking about was there was massive floods in Belgium in the summer of 2021, and it was a national disaster, and like some villages were just totally wiped away. And in their story, they talked about people coming to the brewery and saying, our houses are now completely destroyed. We may as well try and save this place. And, this manor becomes like a community hub where people come. And, they were talking with real, like with vivid description about the words that people said to them, and the fact that people in the village had died, and the chaos that ensued for months and still probably to this day after. And, you become very emotional. And I was aware of the fact that they didn't want to really talk about that too much. So I wanted to be sensitive about including it in the book, but I also had to be honest about the fact that the resilience that these people were displaying, and the amount that the community backed them. And as a result, the connection they now have to the community in terms of what they will do for them is really incredible.
Absolutely.
So it was like moments with that, I was like, I have to be honest with myself. I'm not, absolutely the elements of a Walloon brewery making like hazy New England beer is interesting and important, but let's not, bury the lead here. This is about a story about people and about community and about overcoming, the most difficult of struggles. And this came as a climax to COVID. They were opening in the middle of COVID.
Right.
Government shut out all the HoReCa, all the hospitality venues down. They couldn't open. Financially, it's an absolute disaster. There was a couple of things that happened to them, and they're being very brave. They're canning all their beers. They're trying to have like a tap room where they're bringing people to them rather than getting out into the normal Belgian distribution network. They're brewing like hazy ales and lagers. And they've experimented with other stuff as well. They're big into their art. They're big into their forest imagery because of where they're located. So there's a bunch of people that I went to talk to where I was like, I kind of know what I'm doing here. Like I know what I want the book to be, and I just have to stay true to that, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable or difficult. And if I am going to talk about it, like I'm gonna tell the people, why I'm asking these questions, and if I can get emotional or cry a little bit, which I did like a bunch of times during the writing of this book, then I'm sure readers will feel that emotion as well. And I hope that's the case. I just wanted to make sure that no one regretted talking to me. That was my big thing. But I also had to be honest to the reader about like the stories that I felt were most powerful and most important.
And if you treated it the way you're describing it, I'm sure that your subjects, the brewery, felt fine with it. You weren't sensationalizing a tragedy. Some of the tragedy was, like you said, it was the story. How can you talk about this brewery without that? So well done. Well, the book is as you can hear, absolutely riveting. There are so many. There's 24 stories, and several stories within the 24. As you can hear, I learned about a brewery based around cycling, as you'd mentioned, is very big in Belgium. Yeah, cool story there. Brewers who spend a lot of time in America before deciding to go home and open a brewery. And so there's just a lot of back and forth and circling around in such a fascinating way about Belgian beer Stories. It could have been called that. I mean, I love Hidden Beers of Belgium because you are really learning about beers that you probably wouldn't have heard of. But it also could have been called Stories of Belgian Beer because that's throughout the book. Where can people find it, Brendan, to purchase?
So there's an American distributor of the book, so it's pretty much available anywhere you can buy books. I think all the Amazon, bookshop.org. I think even in like Target and Walmart online you can get it. So it's like very available in America. It comes out in the States on the 10th of November. And thankfully there's already been quite some good interest in the States from the book. So, the publisher told me recently that there's quite a lot of pre-orders, which is really exciting.
I'll put a link to it in the description of this show as well and on our website so that people can go direct to buy it. Of course, you can go to Brendan's own website and podcast and blog, which is Belgian Smack. That's SMAAK.com, BelgianSmack.com. And that's a good hub for everything. In fact, I think if you sign up for the book there, you get a bunch of extra bonuses from Brendan, too. I think I saw that, right?
Sure do.
So, hey, just wonderful to speak with you. And Joanne did Joanne's the last name, forgive me.
Ashley Joanna, yeah.
Ashley Joanna just did a wonderful photographer. She did wonderful work to go with the story. Really brings it all to life. It's a hardcover, so it's the kind of book you want to sit down and experience. I did experience it with a beer, Brendan, so I did it for you. Don't worry. I put beer in my glass.
I can read it with a beer now, but just,
yeah. I know you've just completed this, but is there anything next for you, or you're back to your normal, if it can be called that, journalism routine now that the book is out?
Yeah, so I kind of it took up so much time, obviously, that I'm keen to get back into some of the bigger stories that we do on Belgian Smack. Working with a few other great writers that I love and getting them to cover stuff in Belgium. So that's going to continue the writing and the podcast there. Great.
Well, I look forward to more from you now. That I love that you're on my radar now, and I hope to meet you in person, either in Belgium or when you're coming out this way for some events. Please let us know.
Yeah, pop into the Hop Grenade, absolutely, no problem.
There we go.
Good pleasure.
All right, Brendan Kearney, ladies and gentlemen, go to BelgianSmack.com. You can learn more and get the book, Hidden Beers of Belgium. It's a wonderful read, and take it with you on your next trip or to the bottle shop that you might have here in the U.S. I did find at least the Tilquin is available around me, so you might be able to get some of the beers and then read about them sitting in the comfort of your home as well. All right. Thanks, listeners, and thanks once again to our sponsors. I got to thank Beersmith. You can get your free desktop trial, the free web version trial, over at beersmith.com. It's the best brewing software alive, and it's still actively managed by the founder and writer, Brad Smith. Go to beersmith.com. Check them out. Been a supporter of ours for a long time, but believe me when I say it is the best brewing software. You just don't have to take my word for it. Go try the free web version. Pretty sure you can do that in Belgium, too. So if you're a home brewer or a pro brewer and need to get a wrangle on your ingredients, go to beersmith.com and check it out. All right, folks, we've got more shows coming up with you. GABF award winner Morgan Territory is coming on the show next, so I'm excited to talk to Craig. He's been around the industry for a long time, and we're going to find out what's new at Morgan Territory, including taking home 3 medals from the 2024 Great American Beer Festival. All right, folks, take care of yourselves and your beer. The Session is a production of the Brewing Network and brought to you by More Beer. Check them out at morebeer.com. Find more content and live video of this show on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Brewing Network. For sponsorship opportunities and information, please reach out to advertising@thebrewingnetwork.com. To reach our hosts, contact feedback@thebrewingnetwork.com.